Hi everybody, welcome back to our series on the houses, comparing and contrasting the traditional and exoteric with the esoteric perspectives and how these two different angles relate and transform when we approach the chart from the soul-centered point of view. So let's start with the traditional significations of the fifth house. We have creativity, hobbies and favorite activities, games and sports, children. So this theme overall of creative expression, enjoyment, and these sorts of activities that stem from that authentic place of being. And the final signification also is romance and sex, that comes as another example of that creative act of enjoyment. So these themes of enjoyment, fun, games, activities, youth, these are the archetypal themes that we're touching on in the fifth house. Now consider the fact that the fifth house makes a trine to the first house being that place of identity, of personality, or esoterically the soul purpose, but let's just play exoterically for the moment. Identity, selfhood, and the fundamental mode of expression of the self, and we have this trine to the fifth house, which is now colouring those personality attributes in a way where we're really just talking about those activities and fields of enjoyment that stimulate the interests of the personality or that are an extension of the personal self. So there's a little hint there in terms of the house relationships with the trines, and typically, depending on the house system, but for the most part, there will be an elemental affinity between the zodiacal signs that are accessing the first and the fifth house, whether that's air, earth, fire, or water. So there's this affinity here, and so this extension of the creative act of enjoyment, hobbies, games, sports, all of this. And even with in the case of sports or games, if the first house is the house of the physical body and the movement of that fundamental vitality of the physicality, then that's kind of what sports are as well. Same with any creative enjoyment or hobby, but sports are kind of that literal manifestation of a bit of the Mars energy in terms of that fundamental activity, physicality of the body in that way. And in that we can also see the relationship to sex, sexuality as a part of that natural expression, and then children as well. So let's talk about Leo then, because there is an archetypal affinity with the zodiacal signs, and I've discussed in a couple of videos already in this house system series. I'm just repeating it here in case you're someone new who's stumbled on this video, that while there is some debate about whether it makes sense to apply the zodiacal sign with the house, there is very clearly, when we look at it esoterically or a bit more psychologically, there is definitely an archetypal relationship, but we want to be careful not to overlay the house significations onto the sign. So the Leo placement, having lots of planets in Leo, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with children or play or activities and hobbies, etc. Although we can, when we take the sign Leo, and apologies, I'm using this as another example because I'm repeating this example from my other video, but in the case of Leo, we see the creativity of the self, the importance of that centralizing energy of self-consciousness, which is so akin to the Leo theme. And in that way we can see the relationship of the extension of the creative self there. That's the archetypal relationship between the sign and the house. But then of course we delineate them differently when we look at these different areas of expression. Okay, so that's a good overview of the exoteric significations. What about the esoteric significations? Remember, we're always looking at this kind of octave up or an octave deeper, a deeper angle of the spiral when we approach it esoterically. So if the fifth house is a further expression in that trine that it makes to the first house of the personality self, then this is going to be also true for the esoteric level of expression, for the soul expression. If the first house is evocative of the soul purpose and the fundamental orientation and gift of the soul in this life, what it's ultimately doing, then the fifth house is going to indicate those creative acts and activities that stimulate the will of the soul or are an extension of the will of the soul. So if we play with an example, let's say you are a Pisces rising and you are most likely going to have Cancer thus on the 5th house axis. We would say from an esoteric point of view that Pisces is that plutonic energy of the end of the personal self and dying into the impersonal self. We're talking universal compassion in terms of that Neptunian quality, and the connecting through the heart, activating the heart center, the path of mysticism, all of these qualities with a Pisces ascendant. And Cancer is going to tell us at that 5th house point something about the nature of the activities which are going to flesh out the soul purpose of the Pisces rising. So that could be what's an esoteric Cancerian kind of orientation. Cancer is all about, it's the mother, it's nurturing, it's sustenance from a universal angle. Exoteric Cancer is the personal relationships and kind of limiting it like the crab in that way, going into the shelter. The esoteric Cancer is ruled by Neptune, so also a nice planetary affinity here in the case of Pisces and Cancer. But the desire to give all of humanity what is needed. So perhaps this is a person that's going to be stimulated into some sort of volunteer work, feeding the homeless. That's only one angle. Maybe it's to do with providing shelter, building homes for people, or some kind of transmission about the nature of the dark mother if we're taking the more yin death aspect of Cancer as a sign, and some of the lunar mysteries that come with that. Maybe there's some sort of transmission of the feminine component of being that's being brought into the forefront there with Cancer on the 5th house. So when we approach the 5th house esoterically, it is going to indicate the kinds of creative work, the mission, the way in which that soul purpose is going to actualize and come out in a creative way. So in that way, it's quite it's a good house in terms of demonstrating where we want to start orienting our vital energies. That's the creative instinct, and that's the higher angle of the sex component of the 5th house. So sexuality in the 5th house is about the enjoyment and the play between two human beings from the body identification level. That would be the personality, and of course the product of two people coming together engaging in sex would be the child, right? So then the higher archetypal angle of that is that kind of creative engagement with the soul's purpose, and then the creative product of that higher divine inspiration in the case of the soul. With that, let's go to Oken's list for, that is Alan Oken's soul-centered astrology. We're going to the house signification list. We're going one by one. We'll read the exoteric signification followed by the soul expression version of that point. Right, so number 1, we've got 5th house 1, personal will. So a little bit of that echo to the 1st house again. Soul-centered expression of spiritual will. In this case, the direction of the spiritual will heading into creative activities. 2, active creative self-expression, and while I didn't touch on this before, it was implied. We see a lot of creative artists, performers with 5th house emphasis in the natal chart, exoterically considered. So active creative self-expression, soul-centered, actualization of the higher self, and in this case that actualization as it pertains to the unfolding of the creative acts and the creative products. That's the actualization part of the soul. 3, romance and love affairs, soul-centered expression, love manifesting as the will to merge with the plan through one's creative expression. So just what we touched on before there, redirecting our creative vital energies of enjoyment in a way that's aligning with that soul purpose. 4, children, soul-centered, creativity stimulated by the soul's love. So nice angle there in terms of if we're talking about sex between two people as an act of the love or enjoyment of each other, and then that turning over into the creative product inspired by a higher love, right? 5, hobbies and favorite activities, expression of the will to serve. 6, games, sports, and soul-centered activities which stimulate the will. So just touching again on the nature of that trine angle from 1st to the 5th house. Now we are starting to see a bit of a pattern emerging between the order of the house progressions here, where in the 1st house, of course, we have the will and purpose of the soul. In the 3rd house, we talked about, because that would be a sextile angle, right, from the 3rd to the 1st house. Now, the 3rd house talks about the evolutionary process and the way by which the solar life can unfold and develop. That's the house of the goddess, of the unfolding evolutionary process. We use Buckminster Fuller as the example in the 3rd house video. And now to the next odd number, the 5th house. We've got even more colouring of the process of emergence of that soul purpose, where the will of the purpose, 1st house, unfolding of the soul's expression in the 3rd house, and the actualization of that creative will in the 5th house. So it's something to ponder on there, just in terms of sensing some other abstract layers of these relationships that come into play here. So in my chart, for example, going to a personal anecdote, I have Gemini rising, so I've got Libra on the 5th house. Now, if you know anything about Libra, esoterically, Libra is a pretty significant sign because it speaks to the higher pairs of opposites in the case of the material life versus the spiritual life, or the personality versus the soul, and Gemini has a bit of a similar affinity to that there. And DK in Esoteric Astrology describes Libra, that the Libran problem that every person at some point touches upon, whether or not they have a prominent Libra in the chart, where if there's some sort of seesaw effect that goes on between the values of the personality life and the expression of the personality life with the soul. So I just mentioned that as an example because that particular Libran problem of seesawing has very much come up consistently with 5th house themes. My chart exoterically has a lot of 5th house emphasis. I have Venus in my 1st house, which rules Libra exoterically, so there's a strong tie-in with 1st and 5th house themes, and I had all of those different angles pretty much with the exception of games and sports. But even that showed up in a certain way. With the 5th house ruler being in the 1st house, being quite relevant to the personality, I was a performer. I did performing arts. I was a musician, so those are Venusian artistic themes there, and also 5th house creative themes. I also worked with children. I was a kids party entertainer, so there you've got the performance element there, like da-da-da-da. So all these different things there. I taught kids, taught dance, taught some music classes. So very much a good chart example of a 5th house emphasis. And after having my big awakening and going through all the things that came with that, I found that Libra seesaw would always come back in this way of being confused and unsure about how I was meant to direct my creative energy. And okay, I've still got the desire to create in this very Libran exoteric Venusian way, but then that feels quite different to the soul, and like how do these two things fit together? Because that's the nature of Libra, is this seesaw effect, and there is a relationship between the two halves of the self, but there's some sort of, it has to be worked out through a seesaw, and usually when we finally tip the scales towards the spiritual life, there's like just a reapplication of the vital energy that happens there. So that's a bit of a mini treatment on Libra, but it's a good example of the activation of the 5th house and how in my case it showed up in this very Libran way, demonstrating the Libran seesaw between these this problem of the creative life, and what was I meant to do, what am I meant to create, where should I apply my energy, what's actually most important to me. There's the seesawing of the valuing. So in the natal chart, when we're looking at the 5th house, once again, as is always the case with every house cusp, you look to the exoteric ruler of that sign and where it's placed in the chart, and the esoteric ruler of that sign and where it's placed in the chart. And is there a relationship between those two planets? If there's a square or an opposition, then there's some kind of direct tension or conflict between the two. If there's a trine or a sextile or a harmonic aspect in some way, then there'll be a nice affinity between the two, but there'll still be the problem of having to work out, okay, but what is the nature of that relationship? So there's still a little bit of working out of the problem there, because there's still ultimately the point where we choose that higher path, but it might be something like the skills of my exoteric self kind of naturally lend themselves to, or something like that, to the higher self. So in my case, the esoteric ruler of my 5th house is Uranus. Uranus, depending on the house system, is in the 8th house and the 9th house in a different system, 8th or 9th house. So we're talking here about emotional and psychic regeneration, which would be very 8th housey, very psychological and revealing steps to do with discipleship and the regenerating or the turning over of psychic material. So yes, very accurate. 9th house is also the ageless wisdom teachings, which is kind of what I'm doing here on the channel. This is a very 9th house astrology, also in the traditional mode of analysis, is a 9th house subject matter. 9th house being higher education, big picture thinking, long distance travel. So big picture thinking is what makes it an astrology as a subject that's attributed to the 9th house. So the 9th house esoterically touches on the ageless wisdom teachings. So now we start to see that this, what I'm doing here right now, is a 5th house activity. It's my creative, the product of my creative urge that's being motivated by the soul, which is sitting here making videos about astrology, about the ageless wisdom. So this, and with a psychological bent to bringing in some dimensions from that space. So that's a very Uranus in the 8th/9th house. So seeing how all of these pieces come together there. So look at your own chart and play with the exoteric rulers and have a think, exoteric and the esoteric rulers, and have a think about what that indicates for where the soul wants to emerge with its creative gift and its creative child, so to speak. If you have any planets in the 5th house, have a look at the nature of those planets. Are they benefic? Are they malefic? If you've got challenging planets in there, let's say Pluto or Saturn or Mars, which can sometimes be challenging, not always, but sometimes, then there's going to be something to be worked out in terms of the realm of sex, romance, creative capacity, all of these kinds of things. Something has to be worked out there, especially in the case of Pluto, which would indicate where some kind of death or regeneration of energies need to happen in order to emerge in the soul-centered expression of that. And it's, in a way, it's a similar thing with positive planets. If you've got positive planets there, it's going to be some sort of particular emphasis there on that house, but it would be key to distinguish whether those benefic planets or otherwise neutral planets are expressing in a personality-centered way, and what it might mean for them to express in a higher, in that higher esoteric way. And for that, if you want to learn more about that, you can go to my planetary series, which unpacks the nature of the planets from the exoteric to the esoteric point of view. What I do love about the 5th house is it's a great indicator of process. And if you have the question of what am I supposed to do? What is the nature of my soul work? Where is that going to be actualized? It helps answer these questions. The what do I do question can also be answered somewhat in the 3rd house in terms of what that evolutionary process might look like and what kind of activities to engage in from the place of the supporting of that unfolding. But that 5th house is going to indicate the nature of that creative, again, actualization. It is the divine child, so that which wants to emerge as that expression of the soul's life. So quite a marvelous and interesting house from the esoteric angle, most certainly. Okay, I think that's a good summation of the 5th house. I hope you enjoyed this video today. And if you're a 5th house person, drop me a comment and let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye, guys.